Attention! The command echoed through Terminal C, sharp and precise, cutting through the ordinary noise of rolling suitcases and distant boarding announcements. 50 Navy personnel rose to their feet in perfect unison. Travelers stopped walking. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the airport seemed to hold its breath. And at the center of it all stood a janitor holding a mop, looking as confused as everyone else. No one could understand why an entire Navy honor detail was saluting a man whose name tag simply read Ethan Walker. But the answer began 24 hours earlier. The morning sunlight spilled through the massive glass walls of Reagan National Airport, casting long golden reflections across polished floors. The terminal buzzed with the familiar rhythm of American travel. Wheels rattled over tile. Coffee machines hissed. Flight information boards flickered overhead. In the middle of it all, Ethan Walker pushed a mop bucket across the concourse. At 46 years old, Ethan had become nearly invisible to most people. Travelers hurried past him without making eye contact. Business executives talked loudly into headsets as if he wasn't there. Teenagers stepped around his caution signs without noticing who had placed them. He didn't take it personally. Life had taught him that some of the strongest people were the ones nobody saw. Ethan moved steadily, guiding the mop across the floor with practiced precision. His gray maintenance uniform was clean but worn. His work boots showed years of use. A faded photograph peeked from the edge of his wallet whenever he reached into his pocket. It was a picture of his 11-year-old daughter, Sophie. She was the reason he woke up every morning before sunrise. She was the reason he worked overtime whenever extra shifts became available. She was the reason he kept moving forward, even on the days when grief still found him. 3 years earlier, Ethan had buried his wife after a long illness. Since then, life had become a careful balance of school lunches, homework assignments, soccer practices, and long shifts at the airport. Some nights, he fell asleep sitting upright on the couch. Some mornings, he wondered how he would make it through another day. Yet every time Sophie smiled, he found the strength to continue. Near Gate 27, a group of travelers stood waiting for boarding. One businessman glanced toward Ethan and then immediately looked away. A woman dragging 2 oversized suitcases nearly bumped into his mop bucket without offering a word. Ethan simply stepped aside and kept working. Dignity, he had learned, didn't require an audience. As the morning stretched on, sunlight shifted across the terminal floor. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from a nearby cafe. A child laughed somewhere near the security checkpoint. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Then Ethan noticed something unusual. About 70 feet away, near a row of empty seats, an elderly man stood completely still. He looked lost. Not the ordinary kind of lost that came from missing a gate number. This was different. The man turned slowly in a circle, studying the terminal with uncertain eyes. He held a worn leather carry-on bag in one hand. His shoulders sagged beneath a navy blue jacket. Travelers passed him from every direction, yet no one stopped. No one asked if he needed help. The old man took a few hesitant steps toward an information kiosk. He paused, looked around again, then stopped moving altogether. Ethan watched for several seconds. Something about the scene bothered him. Maybe it was the confusion in the man's face. Maybe it was the way people kept walking past, as if he were invisible. Or maybe Ethan simply recognized loneliness when he saw it. He leaned the mop against the wall and removed his work gloves. Another employee pushing a maintenance cart rolled past him. "Break time already?" the man joked. Ethan smiled faintly. "Just checking on somebody." The employee shrugged and continued down the corridor. Ethan walked toward the elderly stranger. Around them, the terminal continued its endless motion. Departure screens flashed. Boarding groups were called. Suitcases rolled across polished tile. Yet somehow the old man remained alone in the middle of it all. As Ethan approached, he noticed the man's hands trembling slightly. His eyes seemed tired. Not weak, not frightened, just tired in a way that spoke of long years and heavy memories. Ethan stopped a few feet away and offered a gentle smile. "Sir," he said quietly, "you look like you might need a hand." The elderly man lifted his eyes. For a brief second, something flickered across his face. Relief, gratitude, and perhaps something else entirely. Something Ethan could not yet understand. Because neither of them knew that this simple conversation was about to change both of their lives forever. The elderly man looked at Ethan for a long moment before answering. His pale blue eyes carried the kind of weariness that came from decades of responsibility rather than a single difficult day. He tightened his grip on the leather bag and offered a small, embarrassed smile. "I think I may have gotten turned around," he admitted. "I was looking for Gate 14, and somehow I ended up here." Ethan glanced toward the departure screens hanging above the terminal. Gate 14 was nearly half a mile away on the opposite side of the concourse. "That happens more often than you would think," Ethan said gently. "These terminals can feel like small cities." The old man chuckled softly. "That is reassuring. I was beginning to think I had completely lost my touch." Ethan noticed the relief in the man's face. It was not simply about finding a gate. It was the relief of being noticed. The relief of having someone stop long enough to care. "Well, sir," Ethan said, "you are not alone anymore. Let me help you get where you need to go." The old man nodded gratefully. "That is very kind of you." Ethan picked up the leather bag before the man could protest. "Light enough," he said with a smile. "Besides, it gives me an excuse to take a short break." They began walking slowly through the terminal. Around them, thousands of people continued rushing toward meetings, vacations, reunions, and deadlines. Yet for a few moments, Ethan matched his pace to the elderly stranger's careful steps. Neither of them seemed in a hurry. The scent of fresh cinnamon rolls drifted from a bakery kiosk. Airport announcements echoed from overhead speakers. Sunlight reflected across polished floors like ripples across water. "Do you work here?" "Every day?" the old man asked. "Most days," Ethan replied. "I have been here almost 7 years." "You enjoy it?" Ethan thought for a moment. Most people never asked that question. "Some days are better than others," he admitted. "But I get to meet interesting people. That counts for something." The old man smiled. "That sounds like a wise answer." They continued walking. After a few minutes, Ethan noticed the man breathing a little harder. Age had a way of hiding its weight until the distance became noticeable. Ethan pointed toward a nearby seating area. "How about we take a break for a minute?" The old man hesitated. "I do not want to inconvenience you." "You are not," Ethan replied. "Trust me." They sat near a large window overlooking the runway. Outside, a commercial jet taxied toward takeoff. The engines hummed in the distance. For several moments, neither man spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Eventually, Ethan glanced toward a coffee stand nearby. "Can I get you something to drink?" "You do not have to do that." "I know." The old man looked at him carefully. "You seem to say that a lot." Ethan laughed quietly. Maybe because people expect everything to come with conditions these days. A few minutes later, Ethan returned carrying 2 cups of coffee and a blueberry muffin. He placed them on the table. "Breakfast of champions." The old man stared at the food. "You bought this for me. You look like you could use it." The man's eyes softened. "Thank you." They shared the muffin while airplanes moved beyond the glass. The conversation drifted naturally. They talked about weather, baseball, family, the small things people often forget matter most. Eventually, the old man noticed the photograph tucked inside Ethan's wallet when he reached for a napkin. "Your daughter." Ethan smiled immediately. "Sophie. She is 11. Beautiful smile. She got that from her mother." The old man nodded slowly. "And her mother?" Ethan looked out the window for a moment. "She passed away 3 years ago." The words were calm, but they carried familiar weight. "I am sorry," the old man said quietly. "Thank you. That kind of loss never really leaves." Ethan turned toward him. Something in the man's voice sounded personal. "Experienced. You know that firsthand." The old man stared at the runway. "My wife passed away many years ago." For several seconds, neither man spoke. 2 strangers sitting in a crowded airport suddenly shared something far deeper than directions or coffee. They shared absence. They shared memory. They shared the invisible ache left behind by people they loved. "Sophie keeps me moving forward," Ethan finally said. "Some days she probably saves me more than I save her." The old man smiled. "That sounds exactly like family." Nearby, a group of travelers laughed loudly while checking their phones. A toddler pointed excitedly at an airplane. The airport continued its endless motion. Yet something about the morning had changed. The elderly man seemed more relaxed now, more present, as if the confusion that had clouded his expression earlier was beginning to lift. He finished his coffee and carefully folded the napkin on the table. Then he looked directly at Ethan. "You know," he said softly, "most people walk right past an old man who looks lost." Ethan shrugged. "Maybe they are busy." "And maybe," the man replied, They have forgotten how much a small act of kindness can matter. Ethan smiled, but said nothing. He had never been comfortable accepting praise. Across the terminal, however, something else was happening. Near the main entrance, 3 airport security officers were speaking urgently into radios. A woman in a Navy uniform had just arrived. Her expression was calm, but her eyes carried unmistakable concern. She held a photograph in her hand, and for the first time that morning, people were beginning to search for the elderly man sitting quietly beside Ethan Walker. The elderly man followed Ethan's gaze toward the large terminal windows where aircraft moved slowly beneath the bright Virginia sky. For a moment, his expression softened with distant memories. "My grandson used to love watching airplanes," he said quietly. He could tell the difference between aircraft before he was 10 years old. Ethan smiled. "Sounds like a smart kid." He was. The old man paused. "Still is." There was pride in his voice, but also distance, as though family had become something measured in phone calls and holiday visits rather than daily life. Ethan understood that feeling more than he wanted to admit. Parenthood had taught him that love never stopped worrying, no matter how old the children became. Nearby, the terminal continued its endless rhythm. Passengers rolled suitcases past storefronts. A gate agent called boarding groups for a flight to Dallas. The aroma of roasted coffee beans drifted from a nearby cafe. It felt like an ordinary morning. Yet on the far side of the concourse, several airport employees were beginning to exchange concerned looks. Commander Rachel Hayes moved quickly through the terminal with controlled urgency. Her dark Navy service uniform stood out among the travelers. She carried a photograph in one hand while speaking into a radio with the other. "Any updates?" she asked. "Negative," came the response. "No confirmed sighting." Rachel exhaled slowly. The answer did not surprise her. The man they were searching for had always disliked attention. Even now, at 82 years old, he seemed capable of disappearing into a crowd whenever he wanted. "Expand the search area," she instructed. "Check every terminal." Several security officers nodded and moved away. Rachel continued walking. Beneath her professional composure, genuine concern lingered. The individual they were trying to locate was not simply an elderly traveler who had missed his gate. He was a man whose name carried decades of respect throughout the Navy. Yet none of that mattered if he was alone and disoriented in a busy airport. Meanwhile, Ethan and the elderly man remained unaware of the growing search effort. Their conversation drifted toward simpler topics. "So what does Sophie want to be when she grows up?" the old man asked. Ethan laughed softly. "Depends on the week. Last month, she wanted to be an astronaut. Last week, she wanted to be a veterinarian. Yesterday, she decided she might become a teacher. Ambitious. Very." Ethan pulled out his wallet and showed another photograph. Sophie stood beside a science fair display, smiling proudly beneath a homemade banner. The old man's eyes brightened. "She looks happy. She keeps me on my toes. That is usually a sign you are doing something right." Ethan slipped the picture back into his wallet. "Some days I wonder." "Every good parent wonders," the man replied. "The ones who stop wondering are the ones who should worry." Ethan smiled. The advice felt strangely familiar, like something his own father might have said years ago. Before he could respond, a loud voice interrupted from nearby. A young businessman standing in line for coffee glanced toward Ethan and shook his head. "Must be nice," he muttered to a colleague. "Getting paid to sit around drinking coffee." His friend laughed. "Seriously, I picked the wrong career." Neither man bothered lowering his voice. Ethan heard every word. So did the elderly man. The businessman smirked and walked away. The moment passed quickly, but the old man frowned. That was unnecessary. Ethan simply shrugged. "People have bad mornings. You are more forgiving than I would be." Ethan looked down at his coffee cup. "Life gets easier when you stop carrying every insult home with you." The old man studied him carefully. "That sounds like experience talking." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe." For a few seconds neither spoke. Then the old man noticed something unusual. Ethan's posture. The way he sat. The way he remained aware of everything happening around him without appearing distracted. It was subtle. Most people would never notice. But the elderly man had spent much of his life observing people. "You were not always an airport janitor, were you?" he asked suddenly. Ethan blinked. "What makes you say that?" "A feeling." Ethan chuckled. "That is a diplomatic answer." The old man smiled but did not look away. "And yours?" Ethan hesitated. For a brief moment, memories crossed his face. Not painful memories, just old ones. I have done a few different things over the years. Military. Ethan looked surprised. How did you know? The old man tapped the side of his coffee cup. The posture. The awareness. The habit of sitting where you can see every entrance. Ethan laughed quietly. Maybe I am not as invisible as I thought. Not to everyone. Before Ethan could answer, activity increased across the terminal. Several security officers appeared near the information desk. Travelers stepped aside as they moved through the crowd. Rachel Hayes entered the concourse moments later, scanning faces carefully. Then she stopped. Her eyes locked onto the elderly man sitting beside Ethan. Relief washed across her expression so quickly that she did not even try to hide it. She lowered the photograph in her hand. For a second, she simply stood there, almost unable to believe she had found him. Then she began walking toward them with purposeful steps. The old man noticed her first. A faint smile appeared on his face. Not surprise, recognition. And as Rachel approached, Ethan realized that the stranger he had spent the morning helping might not be an ordinary traveler after all. Commander Rachel Hayes stopped a few feet from the table and exhaled a breath that sounded as though she had been holding it for hours. "Sir," she said respectfully, "we have been looking everywhere for you." The elderly man looked up at her and smiled with gentle amusement. "Apparently, I wandered farther than intended." Rachel shook her head, relief softening the professional discipline in her posture. "You had half the airport worried." Ethan glanced between them, suddenly aware that something much larger was unfolding around him. Security officers who had been moving through the terminal moments earlier now slowed their pace. Several employees exchanged curious looks. Travelers nearby began watching the interaction without fully understanding why. The elderly man folded his hands calmly. "Rachel, this is Ethan Walker. He has been kind enough to keep an old man from getting completely lost." Rachel turned toward Ethan. Her eyes immediately registered the maintenance uniform, the work gloves tucked into his belt, and the mop bucket standing nearby. Then she extended her hand. "Thank you for helping him." Ethan shook her hand politely. "It was not a big deal." The old man chuckled softly. "It was a very big deal." Rachel nodded. "I agree." Ethan felt slightly uncomfortable with the attention. He had only stopped to help someone who looked lost. Nothing more. Nothing less. "I was just doing what anyone should do," he said. "Not everyone does," the old man replied quietly. For a moment, silence settled over the table. Outside the terminal windows, another aircraft lifted into the bright morning sky. Sunlight flashed across its wings before it disappeared into the clouds. Rachel finally pulled a chair closer and sat down beside them. Her expression remained respectful, but Ethan noticed something else beneath it. Affection. Not the kind reserved for celebrities or public figures. Something more personal. "We were supposed to meet your flight almost an hour ago," she told the elderly man. "I know. When you were not there, everyone assumed something had happened." Something did happen. The old man smiled toward Ethan. "I made a friend." Rachel followed his gaze. "I can see that." Ethan laughed quietly. "I think you are both giving me too much credit." "Perhaps not enough," the old man replied. A nearby announcement echoed through the terminal. Boarding had begun for a flight to Chicago. Passengers gathered their belongings and formed a line near the gate. Ordinary life continued around them. Yet the small circle surrounding the table felt strangely separate from everything else. Rachel glanced toward the leather carry-on resting beside the chair. "Ready to go?" she asked gently. To Ethan's surprise, the elderly man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the photograph of Sophie, still visible inside Ethan's wallet. "How old is she again?" 11. "Does she know how proud her father should be?" Ethan smiled awkwardly. "She would probably tell you I embarrass her regularly." Rachel laughed. The old man joined her. The sound seemed to erase years from his face. Then his expression became thoughtful. "You know," he said, looking directly at Ethan, "people spend their lives chasing recognition. Promotions, titles, applause. They believe those things prove their worth." Ethan listened quietly. "But the most important moments usually happen when nobody is watching." Rachel's eyes lowered slightly as though she understood exactly what he meant. "This morning," the old man continued, "hundreds of people walked past me. Some were busy. Some never noticed. One person stopped." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Anyone could have. But they did not. The words were not spoken loudly. Yet something about them carried unusual weight. Before Ethan could respond, a young airport employee hurried toward the table. "Commander Hayes," he said nervously, "the transportation team is ready whenever you are." Rachel nodded. "Thank you." The employee left, but not before glancing curiously at the elderly man. It was becoming obvious that whoever he was, people treated him with remarkable respect. Ethan finally decided to ask the question he had avoided all morning. "Sir, if you do not mind me asking, who exactly are you?" Rachel looked toward the elderly man. The elderly man looked toward Rachel. For a second, neither answered. Then a faint smile appeared on the old man's face. "Just someone who served his country a long time ago." Rachel almost laughed. That is one way to describe it. Ethan noticed the exchange immediately. "That sounds like there is more to the story." "There is always more to the story," the old man replied. He slowly rose from his chair. Rachel stood with him. Across the terminal, several security officers straightened almost instinctively when they saw him standing. Ethan noticed it. So did several nearby travelers. Respect seemed to follow this man wherever he went. The old man adjusted his jacket and picked up his bag. Then he turned back toward Ethan. "Would you walk with us a little farther?" he asked. "I would like the company." Ethan glanced toward his mop bucket and unfinished work area. Then he looked at the old man. Something told him this morning was far from over. "Sure," he said. "I can do that." And as the three of them began walking through the terminal together, none of the surrounding travelers realized that within the next few hours, a truth buried for more than a decade would begin to surface, and the quiet janitor beside them would become the last person anyone could overlook. The three of them moved slowly through the terminal, weaving between travelers and rolling suitcases while sunlight poured through the massive glass walls. Ethan walked beside the elderly man, carrying the leather bag despite several polite attempts to take it back. Commander Rachel Hayes remained on the other side, occasionally answering brief messages on her phone, but never straying far. The arrangement felt strangely natural, as though they had known one another longer than a few hours. "You know," the elderly man said as they passed a bookstore, "airports have always fascinated me." "Because of the airplanes?" Ethan asked. "Partly, but mostly because every person here is heading towards something. A new job, a reunion, a second chance. Sometimes all three." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "That is a good way to look at it. Most things are better when viewed through hope." Rachel smiled quietly. "That sounds like something you have been saying for years." "Because it remains true." They reached a quieter section of the terminal overlooking several gates. Outside, aircraft rested beneath a clear blue sky. Ground crews moved methodically across the tarmac. The elderly man paused near the window and watched for a moment. "Beautiful, is it not?" Ethan followed his gaze. "It is. People see machinery. I see stories." Ethan looked at him with curiosity. "You really like airplanes." "You could say that." Rachel laughed softly. "That is a dramatic understatement." The old man grinned, but offered no explanation. They continued walking until they reached a small seating area near a fountain. The sound of flowing water softened the noise of the terminal. Several travelers sat nearby scrolling through their phones. A young family shared breakfast at a corner table. Everything felt calm. For the first time all morning, Rachel seemed to relax. "Sir, your transportation team is still waiting. They can wait a little longer. You are going to make everyone nervous." "That happens occasionally." Ethan shook his head with amusement. "I get the feeling a lot of people listen when you talk. Only when they have no better options." Rachel nearly laughed into her coffee. The old man turned toward Ethan again. "Tell me more about Sophie." Ethan smiled instantly. Few subjects brightened his face faster. "She loves science, loves reading, loves asking questions at the worst possible times." "That sounds healthy." "Last week she spent 40 minutes explaining black holes to me." "And did you understand?" "Not even a little." The old man laughed warmly. Nearby travelers glanced over, drawn by the genuine joy in the sound. "Hold on," Rachel said. "Do you have a picture?" Ethan pulled out his phone. Within seconds, he was showing photographs of Sophie at soccer practice. Sophie holding a science fair ribbon. Sophie standing beside a Christmas tree with an expression that suggested she had received exactly what she wanted. The elderly man studied each image carefully. "She looks happy." "I try." "No," the old man said quietly. "You succeed." The simple statement lingered in the air. Ethan looked away for a moment. Compliments about his parenting always affected him more than compliments about anything else. There had been many nights when he doubted himself, many mornings when exhaustion felt heavier than hope. Yet hearing those words from someone who seemed to understand life carried unexpected weight. Across the terminal, a pair of businessmen walked past. One noticed Ethan's maintenance uniform and frowned. "You are still on the clock, right?" he asked casually. Ethan looked up. "Yes, sir." The man gestured toward the seating area. "Must be nice. Long break." His companion smirked. Neither waited for a response before continuing toward their gate. Rachel's expression hardened slightly. The old man watched the businessman disappear into the crowd. "Interesting." Ethan shrugged. "It is fine." "No," the old man replied. "It is familiar." Ethan looked at him. "What do you mean?" The old man folded his hands. "People often decide who deserves respect before they learn anything about them." Rachel lowered her eyes. "That happens more than it should. Titles, uniforms, salaries, job descriptions." The elderly man's voice remained calm. "Many people mistake those things for character." Ethan sat quietly. Something about the conversation felt personal now, deeper than casual observation. The old man turned toward him. "What was your rank?" Ethan blinked. "My rank? In the military." Ethan hesitated. "Petty officer, first class." Rachel looked up immediately. Something flickered across her expression. Recognition, perhaps. Or surprise. "Navy?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "A long time ago." The old man became very still. "What specialty?" Ethan smiled modestly. "Search and rescue." For the first time since they met, neither Rachel nor the elderly man responded immediately. The fountain continued flowing beside them. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminal. Yet a strange silence settled between the three of them. Then the old man slowly smiled. Not politely, not casually, meaningfully, as though a missing piece of a puzzle had finally fallen into place. The old man's smile lingered for several seconds after Ethan answered. Around them, the sounds of the terminal seemed to fade into the background. Travelers continued moving from gate to gate. Rolling suitcases clicked across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed overhead. Yet something had shifted. Rachel Hayes exchanged a brief glance with the elderly man, and for the first time since arriving, she appeared genuinely curious. "Search and rescue," she repeated. "That is not an easy path." Ethan shrugged modestly. "A lot of people did harder jobs than I did." "That sounds exactly like something a rescue swimmer would say," Rachel replied. Ethan laughed softly. "Old habits, I guess." The old man leaned back slightly in his chair. "How long did you serve?" "Almost 12 years. And then?" Ethan's smile faded just enough to reveal old memories. "Life changed." The answer was simple, but both Rachel and the elderly man understood there was more behind it. Sometimes the deepest chapters of a person's life fit inside only two words. Life changed. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm beside them. Sunlight reflected across the water and danced across the floor. Nearby, several passengers gathered around charging stations while others sat scrolling through phones. Most paid no attention to the small group near the window. A few, however, had begun noticing the unusual amount of respect surrounding the elderly man. Two airport employees whispered quietly as they passed. One pointed toward Rachel's Navy uniform. The other nodded. Questions were beginning to form. Ethan remained unaware. He had spent years learning how to disappear into the background. Recognition rarely crossed his mind. "Do you miss it?" the old man asked. Ethan took a moment before answering. "Sometimes. Only sometimes. I miss the people more than the work." The old man nodded slowly. "That is usually how you know it mattered." Rachel studied Ethan carefully. There was something unusual about him. Not because of his military service. Thousands had served. It was the way he carried himself. No bitterness. No self-promotion. No attempt to impress anyone. Just quiet confidence. The kind that often comes from experience rather than ego. Their conversation was interrupted by a loud voice from across the seating area. "Hey, maintenance guy." Ethan turned. A frustrated traveler stood beside an overflowing trash bin. "You planning to work today, or just hang out drinking coffee?" Several nearby passengers looked over. The man was not shouting, but he was loud enough to ensure everyone heard him. Rachel's expression tightened immediately. The elderly man's eyes narrowed slightly. Ethan simply stood up. "I will take care of it." "Good," the traveler muttered. "Some of us are paying customers." The man walked away before Ethan could respond. For a brief moment, silence settled over the area. Rachel looked ready to say something. The elderly man looked even less pleased. Ethan picked up his gloves and smiled faintly. "Excuse me for a minute." "You do not have to do that right now," Rachel said. "Actually, I do." Ethan walked toward the trash bin without another word. He replaced the liner, cleaned the surrounding area, and returned a few minutes later. No complaint, no frustration, no attempt to defend himself. He simply handled the problem and came back. The elderly man watched the entire thing. "You know," he said quietly when Ethan sat down again, "there was a time when people understood that every honest job carried dignity." Ethan smiled. "Most people still do. Not enough." "Enough." The old man looked at him carefully. "You really believe that?" "I have to." Ethan glanced toward the terminal crowd. "Otherwise, every rude person gets to decide how my day feels." Rachel lowered her eyes. The answer seemed to affect her more than she expected. The old man slowly nodded. "That may be one of the wisest things I have heard in a very long time." Before Ethan could respond, a message appeared on Rachel's phone. She read it and sighed. "The transportation team is asking again." "Persistent group," the old man said. "Very." Rachel hesitated. "There is also another update." "What kind?" She looked from the elderly man to Ethan. "The base has confirmed tomorrow's ceremony." Ethan frowned slightly. "Ceremony?" Rachel immediately realized she had said more than intended. "Nothing important." The old man smiled knowingly. "Rachel." She shook her head. "You always do this." "Do what?" "Pretend major events are minor inconveniences." Ethan looked between them, increasingly confused. "I feel like I joined this conversation halfway through a book." Both of them laughed. Then the old man turned toward him with a thoughtful expression. "Perhaps." His eyes rested on Ethan for a moment longer than usual. "Or perhaps the most important chapter has not been opened yet." The elderly man's final words lingered in Ethan's mind long after they were spoken. "The most important chapter has not been opened yet." It sounded less like a comment and more like a promise. Around them, the terminal remained alive with movement. Families hurried toward departure gates. Business travelers balanced coffee cups and laptops. Children pressed their faces against windows to watch airplanes taxi across the runway. Yet despite all the motion, the small group near the fountain seemed suspended in its own quiet corner of time. Rachel's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and sighed. "I am running out of ways to explain why we are late." The old man smiled. "Tell them I stopped for coffee." "That stopped working 40 minutes ago." Ethan laughed softly. "You must be important." Rachel opened her mouth to answer, but the old man gently raised a hand. "Not today." She immediately stopped. Ethan noticed the exchange. Whatever authority this man carried, it clearly extended beyond rank or position. People listened when he spoke, not because they had to, because they wanted to. A few moments later, a young airport employee approached carrying a clipboard. "Commander Hayes?" Rachel looked up. "Yes." "The airport director would like an update." Rachel nodded. "Tell him everything is fine." The employee glanced toward the elderly man and visibly relaxed. "Yes, ma'am." As he walked away, Ethan shook his head. "You have half the airport worried about you. Apparently, you should feel guilty." The old man smiled. "I feel mildly guilty." Rachel laughed. "That is the closest thing to an apology I have heard in years." The conversation drifted again. They spoke about travel, about favorite places in America, about small towns and coastal cities and hidden diners that served better pie than any expensive restaurant. The old man seemed particularly interested in hearing stories about Sophie. Every time Ethan mentioned his daughter, the elderly man's attention sharpened. "What is the last thing she said before school this morning?" he asked unexpectedly. Ethan smiled immediately. "She told me not to forget parent night next week." "And will you?" "Not if I want to survive." The old man laughed. "Good answer." Then his expression softened. "Children remember presence more than perfection." Ethan looked at him carefully. "You sound like you learned that lesson personally." "I learned some lessons too late." The answer carried enough weight to end further questions. Silence settled briefly between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Reflective silence. The kind that often appears when people begin speaking honestly. Nearby, a television mounted above a waiting area displayed a news broadcast. The volume was low, but a scrolling headline mentioned an upcoming naval ceremony scheduled for the following day. Rachel noticed it immediately. So did the old man. Neither commented. Ethan remained focused on his coffee. "Can I ask you something?" Rachel finally said. Ethan nodded. "Sure." Why did you leave the Navy? The question was simple, but Ethan took longer than usual to answer. He stared through the terminal windows toward the bright afternoon sky. My wife became sick. Rachel's expression changed instantly. I am sorry. It happened a long time ago. Some things never become a long time ago, the old man said quietly. Ethan nodded. That is true. He folded his hands together. When Sophie was little, somebody had to be home. Somebody had to make breakfast and help with homework and sit through doctor appointments. Rachel listened carefully. So you left. It was the right decision. Do you regret it? Ethan smiled faintly. Not for 1 second. The answer came without hesitation. The old man seemed deeply moved by it. You gave up a career. I gained a daughter. The old man's eyes lowered briefly. Rachel looked away toward the windows. Neither spoke. There are moments when truth is so simple that it silences everyone around it. This was one of those moments. Several yards away, a group of travelers had unknowingly been listening. One elderly woman smiled quietly. A younger man lowered his phone. Even strangers recognized sincerity when they heard it. Then something unexpected happened. The old man slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a worn photograph. The edges were faded from years of handling. He looked at it for several seconds before handing it to Ethan. Ethan studied the image. It showed a much younger version of the old man standing beside several Navy personnel near a helicopter. Everyone in the picture was smiling. That was taken a long time ago, the old man said. Ethan examined the photograph carefully. Something about it felt familiar. Not the faces, the setting, the aircraft, the uniforms. Memories stirred somewhere in the back of his mind. Then his eyes widened slightly. Wait. The old man watched him closely. You recognize something? Ethan looked from the photograph to the elderly man. I have seen this unit designation before. Rachel immediately became very still. The old man's smile faded into thoughtful silence. For the first time all day, it seemed as though Ethan Walker had unknowingly stepped closer to a truth that neither of them expected him to uncover. The photograph remained in Ethan's hands as he studied the faded image more carefully. The helicopter, in the background, triggered something buried deep within memory. Not a specific event, not a specific mission, just a feeling, a familiarity, the kind that appears when old chapters of life suddenly brush against the present. I know this insignia, Ethan said quietly. The elderly man remained silent. Rachel's attention sharpened immediately. From where? She asked. Ethan traced a finger near the corner of the photograph. Years ago, during a joint training exercise. I remember seeing it on briefing materials. He looked up. This was connected to a special naval command group, was it not? The old man smiled faintly. Very observant. Ethan handed the photograph back. Not really. Just old memories. Sometimes old memories matter more than people realize, the elderly man replied. Nearby, a boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. Passengers stood and gathered their belongings. The afternoon sun had shifted lower now, casting warm amber reflections across the polished floors. What had started as an ordinary workday was becoming something else entirely. Rachel checked her watch. Sir, if we do not leave soon, there will be schedule problems. There are always schedule problems. That is not a comforting answer. It was not intended to be. Ethan laughed softly. The easy humor between them felt genuine. Yet beneath it all, questions continued growing. He still did not know who this man truly was. He still did not understand why airport staff, security personnel, and Navy officers treated him with such unusual respect. Most of all, he did not understand why the old man seemed increasingly interested in his own past. Can I ask something? Ethan said. Of course, the elderly man replied. Why are you really here? Rachel looked toward him. The old man folded his hands thoughtfully. What do you mean? I mean there is obviously more happening than a delayed flight. The old man smiled. Fair observation. Ethan leaned back. People keep searching for you. There is some kind of ceremony tomorrow. Everyone treats you like you are important. Yet you keep changing the subject. Rachel lowered her eyes to hide a smile. The old man looked out the window, toward the runway. Several aircraft stood in the distance beneath the bright afternoon sky. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly. Tomorrow is a gathering. What kind of gathering? Ethan asked. One involving memory. The answer raised more questions than it answered. Memory. The Navy occasionally remembers old stories. Ethan laughed. You make everything sound mysterious. only because the truth usually sounds unbelievable. Before Ethan could respond, a group of travelers walked past their seating area. One young man glanced toward Rachel's uniform and immediately recognized her rank. He whispered something to his companion. Both looked toward the elderly man with growing curiosity. Word was spreading. People sensed something significant without knowing exactly what it was. The old man seemed completely unaware of the attention, or perhaps completely comfortable with it. Ethan could not tell which. Rachel's phone buzzed again. This time she frowned. "What is it?" the old man asked. "Additional arrivals. Already. 2 aircraft." The old man sighed softly. "They are early." Ethan looked between them. "Who is early?" Rachel hesitated. "Guests. For tomorrow?" "Yes." Ethan nodded slowly. The pieces still refused to fit together. Yet something told him the answer was approaching. Across the terminal, several individuals in Navy uniforms had begun appearing near the main entrance. Nothing dramatic. Nothing formal. Just a steady increase in military personnel moving through the airport. Most travelers never noticed. Ethan did. Years of service had trained him to notice details. He watched as one officer entered, paused briefly, then glanced toward the elderly man before continuing onward. Another did the same. Respect. Recognition. Familiarity. The pattern repeated itself again and again. Ethan finally looked directly at the old man. "I think a lot of people know who you are." The elderly man's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Perhaps. I definitely do not." "That is also true." Rachel laughed quietly. "Sir, you are impossible. I have been called worse." The old man stood slowly from his chair and adjusted his jacket. His expression softened as he looked around the busy terminal. Families, travelers, children, workers, ordinary people living ordinary lives. "You know what I have learned?" he asked. Neither Ethan nor Rachel answered. The world changes because of people nobody notices. His eyes settled on Ethan. The teacher who stays late. The nurse who misses dinner. The mechanic who helps a stranger. The father who keeps showing up. Ethan looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the attention. The old man smiled. History rarely remembers them properly. Rachel remained silent. She seemed to understand exactly where the conversation was heading. Then the elderly man looked directly at Ethan and asked a question that seemed to come from nowhere. "Tell me something. During your years in search and rescue, were you ever stationed near Norfolk?" Ethan froze. Only for a second. But Rachel noticed. The old man noticed. And for the first time all afternoon, a strange expression crossed Ethan Walker's face. Recognition. For a moment Ethan said nothing. The sounds of the terminal seemed distant now, blurred beneath the sudden rush of memory. Norfolk. The name alone carried years of forgotten mornings, ocean air, flight decks, training exercises, and long stretches of service that felt like another lifetime. The elderly man watched him carefully. Rachel remained completely still. "Yes," Ethan finally said. "I was stationed near Norfolk." The old man nodded slowly as though confirming something he had suspected all along. "What years?" Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" Humor an old man. Ethan smiled faintly. "About 14 years ago. Maybe a little longer." The old man exchanged another glance with Rachel. This time neither bothered hiding it. Ethan noticed immediately. "Okay," he said. "Now I know something is going on." Rachel opened her mouth, then stopped herself. The old man looked toward the large windows overlooking the runway. Several aircraft were preparing for departure beneath the late afternoon sun. "Do you remember a winter operation off the Virginia coast?" he asked quietly. Ethan's expression changed. There were a lot of winter operations. This one involved severe weather. Ethan looked down. The memory was becoming clearer. Maybe. A support aircraft diverted unexpectedly. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" Rachel's heart seemed to skip a beat. The old man simply smiled. "Because some stories travel farther than people realize." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "That was a long time ago. Do you remember it?" "Pieces." The old man waited. Eventually, Ethan sighed. The weather changed faster than expected. Visibility dropped. Communications became difficult. Everybody was focused on getting people home safely. And Ethan shrugged. "And we did our jobs." The answer came immediately, almost automatically. Rachel shook her head. "You keep saying that." Ethan looked confused. "Saying what?" "We did our jobs." The old man nodded. Some people use those words when they do something ordinary. Others use them when they do something extraordinary and do not want attention. Ethan laughed quietly. Trust me, nobody remembers that operation. The old man became very thoughtful. You may be surprised. Nearby, another group of Navy personnel entered the terminal. Their arrival drew little attention from most travelers, but Ethan noticed. Years of military service had trained him to notice patterns. The number of uniforms in the airport seemed to be increasing steadily. Not dramatically, just enough to feel unusual. One officer paused briefly when he spotted the elderly man. Respect flashed across his face before he continued walking. Ethan caught that too. I think half the Navy is passing through this airport today, he joked. Rachel almost smiled. Not half. A quarter? Maybe. The old man chuckled softly. Yet beneath the humor, something significant was approaching. Ethan could feel it. The conversation. The questions. The repeated references to his service. None of it felt accidental anymore. Can I ask something directly? Ethan said. Of course, the old man replied. Have we met before? Rachel looked down immediately. The old man remained silent for several seconds. I do not believe so. Then why do I get the feeling you know more about me than you should? The elderly man folded his hands. Because I asked. Questions after meeting you. Questions. You mentioned Norfolk. Ethan shook his head. No. Before that. Silence. For the first time all day, the old man's smile faded. Not completely. Just enough to reveal genuine emotion beneath it. Perhaps, he said quietly, because your name was familiar. Ethan stared at him. Rachel stared at him too. The terminal noise continued around them. Boarding calls echoed overhead. Travelers rushed toward gates. Coffee machines hissed. Yet the small space surrounding their table felt completely still. My name? Ethan asked. Yes. Why? The old man looked directly into his eyes. Because there are some names you hear once and never forget. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Something in the man's expression prevented him. This was no longer casual conversation. Whatever truth had been slowly approaching all afternoon was finally close enough to touch. Then Rachel's phone rang again. She answered immediately. Her expression changed within seconds. Understood, she said quietly. We will be there shortly. She ended the call and looked at the elderly man. Sir, they have arrived. The old man nodded. All of them? Yes. Ethan frowned. All of who? Neither answered immediately. The old man slowly stood. Sunlight reflected across the terminal windows behind him. For a brief moment, he looked less like a confused traveler and more like someone accustomed to carrying responsibility. Someone accustomed to being followed. Someone accustomed to being remembered. Then he turned toward Ethan and smiled. I think it is finally time for you to learn why so many people have been looking for me. The elderly man began walking slowly toward the main concourse, and Ethan followed beside him while Rachel remained only a step behind. The atmosphere in the terminal felt different now. Not louder, not busier, different, as though invisible currents were moving beneath the surface of an ordinary afternoon. Travelers continued toward their gates. Families gathered near departure screens. Airport employees pushed carts loaded with supplies. Yet more and more people seemed to glance in their direction. Ethan noticed it. Immediately. Okay, he said quietly. I am officially curious. The old man smiled. That took longer than I expected. You disappear in an airport, half the Navy starts looking for you, and now apparently someone important has arrived. I think curiosity is a reasonable response. Rachel laughed softly. I agree. They rounded a corner and entered a larger section of the terminal near the executive arrivals area. Ethan stopped walking. Ahead of them stood several Navy officers in formal service uniforms. Some were senior officers. Others appeared younger. Yet every one of them seemed focused on the elderly man. The moment they noticed him approaching, conversations stopped. Postures straightened. Expressions shifted. Respect moved through the group almost visibly. Ethan looked from one face to another. Wow. The old man sighed as though mildly inconvenienced. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid. Rachel smiled. You failed. One of the senior officers stepped forward. He appeared to be in his late 50s, carrying himself with calm authority. Sir, he said warmly, we have been concerned. I was having coffee. For nearly 3 hours. It was good coffee. Several officers smiled. Ethan remained completely confused. Then the senior officer noticed him standing beside the old man. His attention lingered for a moment. And this is? Before Rachel could answer, the elderly man spoke. A good man. The officer nodded immediately. No further explanation seemed necessary. Understood. Ethan blinked. That is all you need? Coming from him? The officer replied. Yes. The answer only deepened the mystery. Nearby travelers had begun slowing down. Not enough to cause a disturbance, just enough to observe. Uniformed personnel naturally attract attention. Large groups of uniformed personnel attract even more. The old man looked toward the senior officer. How many arrived? Most of them. Already. Several wanted extra time before tomorrow. Ethan folded his arms. Tomorrow must be a pretty big event. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable silence. Deliberate silence. Rachel looked at the old man. The officers looked at the old man. Finally, the old man turned toward Ethan. Tomorrow marks the anniversary of a mission. Ethan nodded slowly. A mission? One that changed many lives. Something in the way he said it made Ethan pay closer attention. The old man continued. People often remember leaders, commanders, officials, but they forget the men and women who actually carried the burden. Ethan looked away slightly. That sounds familiar. Does it? The people doing the work are usually the last ones anyone notices. The old man's eyes softened. Exactly. For several seconds neither spoke. Then the senior officer reached into a folder he had been carrying. Sir, there is something else. He handed over a document. The old man reviewed it briefly before looking back at Ethan. Interesting. What? Ethan asked. The old man held out the paper. Take a look. Ethan accepted it politely. At first glance it appeared to be an event schedule. Names, arrival times, seating assignments, recognition ceremony, memorial presentation. Then his eyes stopped on one specific section. A photograph had been attached near the bottom. The image was old, grainy, taken years earlier. Several Navy personnel stood near a rescue helicopter. Ethan stared. His pulse quickened. He recognized the scene immediately. He had been there. Not in the photograph. Nearby. The memory returned suddenly and completely. The weather, the aircraft, the faces, the operation. No, Ethan whispered. The old man watched him carefully. You remember. Ethan looked up. How is this connected? The senior officer exchanged a glance with Rachel. Neither spoke. Then the old man stepped closer and lowered his voice. Because the mission being honored tomorrow is the same one you told me nobody remembers. Silence followed. Complete silence. The sounds of the terminal seemed to disappear. Ethan stared at him. The officers stood quietly. Rachel looked almost emotional. And for the first time since this strange day began, Ethan Walker realized that the story he believed had been forgotten might never have been forgotten at all. Ethan stared at the photograph and then at the elderly man standing before him. The terminal around them continued moving, but it no longer felt real. The voices, the footsteps, the rolling luggage, all of it seemed distant. That mission was never supposed to become a story, Ethan said quietly. Most missions are not, the old man replied. Yet some become part of other people's lives forever. Ethan looked down at the schedule again. The anniversary date matched exactly. 14 years earlier. A winter operation off the Virginia coast. A day he had not thought about in years. Not because he forgot it. Because he never considered it special. It had simply been another day wearing the uniform. Another day doing what needed to be done. Rachel watched his expression carefully. You really did not know? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Know what? The senior officer stepped closer. That operation became one of the most studied rescue cases in modern Navy training programs. Ethan blinked. What? For years. Ethan laughed once in disbelief. No, there has to be some mistake. There is no mistake, the officer replied. Your team prevented a situation from becoming far worse than anyone predicted. Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. My team? Exactly. Not me. The elderly man smiled. Still doing it. Doing what? Rachel asked softly. Giving the credit away. Ethan looked away toward the windows. The late afternoon sunlight painted the terminal in gold. Because it belongs to other people too. That answer, the old man said quietly, is one of the reasons your name survived. Silence settled between them. Ethan could not understand what he was hearing. For years he had worked double shifts, paid bills, raised Sophie, and lived a life so ordinary that most travelers barely noticed him walking through the terminal. He had never expected anyone to remember events from another lifetime. The elderly man slowly reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small leather card holder. He opened it and handed over an identification card. Ethan accepted it automatically. Then he froze. The name, the rank, the insignia. Suddenly, every strange moment from the day made sense. The airport search, the Navy officers, the respect, the ceremony. Ethan looked up slowly. You are Admiral Thomas Bennett. The old man nodded once. Retired, thankfully. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. Even Rachel smiled at his reaction. I spent half the day giving directions to an admiral. You spent half the day helping a confused old man, Bennett corrected gently. That part matters more. Ethan shook his head and laughed quietly. I cannot believe this. Neither could the transportation team, Rachel admitted. Several nearby officers smiled. The atmosphere felt lighter now that the truth had finally surfaced. Yet Bennett's expression remained thoughtful. There is another reason I wanted to meet you today. Ethan looked up. Meet me? Not by accident. Rachel glanced toward the admiral, but said nothing. The senior officer remained silent as well. Bennett folded his hands behind his back. A few months ago, preparations began for tomorrow's ceremony. Names were reviewed. Records were examined. Stories were collected. Ethan listened carefully. One name appeared again and again. He already knew the answer before it was spoken. Mine. Bennett nodded. Yours. Ethan immediately shook his head. There were dozens of people involved. Yes. Some sacrificed far more than I did. Yes. Then why me? For the first time all afternoon, the admiral's eyes appeared emotional. Not dramatic. Just honest. Because every report ended the same way. Ethan waited. Different officers. Different witnesses. Different years. Bennett smiled faintly. Yet they all described the same thing. What? Bennett took a slow breath. A man who stepped forward when needed and stepped back when praise arrived. Nobody spoke. The words hung in the air. Rachel lowered her eyes. The senior officer looked toward the floor. Even the surrounding conversations seemed quieter somehow. Ethan swallowed hard. I was just doing my job. Bennett smiled warmly. Exactly. Then he placed a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. And tomorrow, for the first time in 14 years, the people who never forgot are finally going to tell you what that meant to them. The next morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze moving across the naval base outside Washington. Ethan Walker almost did not come. Even after everything Admiral Bennett had told him, the invitation sitting on his kitchen table still felt like it belonged to someone else. Sophie had been the one who convinced him. Dad? She had said while helping him straighten his tie. If an admiral personally asks you to show up, you should probably show up. Now, standing near the edge of a large ceremonial hangar filled with Navy personnel, veterans, families, and invited guests, Ethan felt completely out of place. He wore a simple suit he had not taken out of the closet in years. Around him, rows of uniforms reflected decades of service and achievement. Medals caught the morning light. Conversations drifted softly through the crowd. At the center of it all stood a large display honoring the anniversary of the operation from 14 years earlier. Ethan studied the photographs arranged across the exhibit walls. Helicopters, rescue crews, flight teams, group photographs, historical summaries, names. So many names. Men and women who had gone on with their lives. Some still serving, some retired, some no longer living. Yet all connected by a single day that Ethan had barely thought about in years. You made it. Ethan turned and saw Rachel approaching. Sophie threatened to never let me forget it if I stayed home. Rachel laughed. Smart kid. Very. Sophie stood nearby, looking around with wide eyes. Dad, there are pictures of helicopters everywhere. I noticed. This is actually kind of amazing. Ethan smiled. Kind of. Okay. Really amazing. Before he could respond, movement near the front of the hangar drew everyone's attention. Admiral Bennett had arrived. Unlike the previous day, there was no confusion about who he was. Conversations immediately quieted. People stood. Respect moved through the room like a wave. Yet as Bennett approached the stage, his eyes found Ethan almost immediately. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of taking his seat, the admiral walked directly toward him. Several officers noticed. So did dozens of guests. Bennett stopped beside Ethan and Sophie. Good morning. Sophie smiled. Good morning, Admiral. You must be Sophie. Yes, sir. Bennett nodded. Approvingly. Your father talks about you constantly. Ethan looked embarrassed. Sophie grinned. That sounds right. The Admiral laughed warmly. Then he looked toward the stage. It is almost time. Ethan followed his gaze. For what exactly? Bennett's expression softened. For some overdue recognition. Moments later, the ceremony began. Speakers honored the operation. Historical footage appeared on large screens. Former crew members shared memories. Stories were told. Names were read. Applause filled the hangar several times. Ethan listened quietly. The operation sounded larger and more significant than he had ever realized. Then the commanding officer stepped to the podium and paused. The room gradually fell silent. "There is one final recognition," he announced. "One that should have happened many years ago." Ethan felt a strange knot form in his stomach. The officer continued. "History often remembers leaders. It often remembers commanders. Yet sometimes the individuals who make the greatest difference are the first to step away from the spotlight." The giant screen behind him changed. A photograph appeared. Ethan froze. It was an old service photograph of himself. Younger, leaner, wearing a Navy uniform. Murmurs spread through the audience. Sophie looked from the screen to her father with complete shock. "Dad." Ethan could not speak. The officer smiled. Petty Officer First Class Ethan Walker spent years refusing attention for actions that affected countless lives. Every report we reviewed contained the same description. Quiet professionalism, selfless service, unshakable integrity. The hangar became completely silent. Then the officer looked directly toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, would you please join us?" Hundreds of eyes turned. Ethan stood slowly. He felt every step as he walked toward the stage. The applause began softly at first. Then it grew. Veterans stood. Active duty personnel stood. Families stood. The sound filled the hangar. Yet what affected Ethan most was not the applause. It was what happened when he reached the front. Row after row of Navy personnel rose to their feet and faced him. Not because of rank. Not because of position. Because of respect. Ethan stopped walking. His eyes moved across the crowd. Admiral Bennett stood first. Rachel stood beside him. Then every uniformed sailor in the hangar followed. For a moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. And in that powerful silence, Ethan Walker finally understood that the people he believed had forgotten had been remembering all along. The applause eventually faded, but the silence that followed carried far greater weight. Ethan stood at the front of the hangar, looking across a sea of faces that reflected respect rather than admiration. There was a difference. Admiration often focused on achievement. Respect focused on character. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt seen not for what he had done, but for who he had chosen to be. The commanding officer stepped aside and allowed Admiral Bennett to approach the podium. The elderly admiral moved slowly, yet every person in the room seemed to follow him with their eyes. When he reached the microphone, he looked toward Ethan before speaking. "Yesterday morning," he began, "I found myself standing alone in an airport terminal, uncertain where I was supposed to be." Gentle laughter moved through the audience. Bennett smiled. "That part is unfortunately true." More laughter followed. Then his expression softened. Hundreds of people passed by. Most were busy. Some were distracted. None of them were wrong for continuing on with their day. The room grew quiet again. But one man stopped. Bennett looked directly at Ethan. "He did not know my name. He did not know my rank. He did not know there would ever be a ceremony or an audience or a room full of people." Sophie sat in the front row listening with shining eyes. He saw an elderly man who needed help, and he helped him. Not because anyone was watching. Not because there was something to gain. Simply because that is who he is. The admiral paused. The silence deepened. "Yesterday reminded me of something important. The same qualities that made Ethan Walker valuable in uniform are the qualities that define him today. Duty, humility, compassion, quiet dignity." Several veterans nodded. Others lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Bennett continued. "We spend a great deal of time celebrating extraordinary moments. Yet the truth is that character is revealed in ordinary moments. A stranger needing directions. A child needing encouragement. A family needing support. A difficult day that requires grace instead of anger." Ethan felt his throat tighten. Every word seemed larger than the ceremony itself. 14 years ago, Bennett said, many people benefited from Ethan's service. Yesterday, I benefited from his kindness. The admiral stepped away from the microphone and walked toward him. Then, in front of everyone present, he extended his hand. Ethan accepted it immediately. The gesture was simple. No dramatic announcement. No elaborate presentation. Just one man thanking another. Yet somehow it felt more powerful than any medal. The audience rose once again, not because they were instructed to, because they wanted to. Sophie stood first. Rachel stood beside her. Then veterans, officers, families, and guests followed. The applause returned, warmer than before. Ethan glanced toward his daughter. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but her smile never wavered. He smiled back. Later, as the ceremony concluded and people slowly began leaving the hangar, dozens approached to shake his hand. Some shared memories. Others simply said thank you. Ethan accepted every conversation with the same humility he had shown all day. Eventually, the crowd thinned. The afternoon sun streamed through the open hangar doors, painting long golden shadows across the floor. Sophie walked beside him as they headed toward the parking lot. "Dad," she asked. "Yeah. Are you famous now?" Ethan laughed. "Definitely not." "Good. Why good?" Sophie smiled. "Because I like you the way you are." Ethan placed an arm around her shoulders. "I like you the way you are too." Behind them, Admiral Bennett watched from the doorway. Rachel stood nearby. "You were right," she said quietly. Bennett nodded. "About what?" "The most important people are usually the ones nobody notices." The Admiral smiled as Ethan and Sophie disappeared into the afternoon sunlight. "Notices eventually," he replied. Father and daughter continued walking toward their car, blending into the ordinary world once more. Tomorrow Ethan would return to the airport. He would push the same mop bucket, clean the same floors, help the same travelers. Most people would never know what had happened. Most would never recognize his name. And that was perfectly fine with him. Because some men spend their lives demanding respect. Others earn it quietly long before the world finally catches up. And when the world does catch up, the greatest reward is not applause. It is the knowledge that kindness, dignity, and character were never wasted. They were simply waiting for the right moment to be seen.